Hello, everybody. Good morning from New York. My name is Stefan Schweinfest, Director of the UN Statistics Division. I'm really very happy to have you all numerously connected. I see the numbers still going up around the world for this final seventh virtual sprint under the Beyond GDP heading. I mean, we started in June, and here we are 4 months later, and we've had a very rich discussion, quite a number of themes. And I think today's topic is going to be to get a little bit of an overview of where we traveled through and where we may be traveling to. Last time, let me just look a little bit back. The sixth sprint, we had over 120 participants from all over the world. That was on the topic of composite measures. And again, I was very happy that we had a very interesting mix of participants, both in terms of types of organizations that you represent, national, international, um, uh, regional, sectoral, and different subject matter experts. Of course, this is the economics network, so there are a lot of economists, but not only. We've had friends from other parts. And I was also happy that we had different types of representation in terms of the levels in an institution. Sometimes it was more the technical level that bring the expertise to the room, but we also had directors and executives so who have to help us manage this overall topic. So I think this is a great group and to take topics forward. And talking about taking topics forward, this is now after the six topical meetings, it's now time to look back and look forward, and that's what we want to do. So we had discussions in the six topical meetings in the last 3, 4 months on social demographic statistic, national accounts, health statistic, labor statistics, and how these communities and regional organizations measure and monitor inclusive and sustainable well-being and quality of life. We were looking at themes when measuring well-being. We were looking at environment, social governance, the ESG corporate perspective. We were looking at dashboards and mapping distributional frameworks beyond averages. We had one beyond average session. And then, as I just mentioned, the last session looked at composite well-being and sustainable indicators. So quite a broad spectrum. And I think it's opportune now today that we look back and see, go back to the roots and say, what were the questions we set out to answer? What have we learned by the stock taking exercise? And what is the best way forward? As I mentioned several times before, the policy agenda is set. We had just the summit at the United Nations Sustainable Development Summit that had highlighted the importance of data in general terms and the need to invest in data. And then there is the specific focus articulated by the United Nations Secretary General's policy brief on valuing what counts, an encouragement to develop a framework to progress beyond GDP, which is a consequence of the common agenda that the Secretary General launched with a view to prepare our summit of the future that will take place in the fall, just around this time next year, 2024. So that is a framework where we can make a contribution. We are invited to make contributions. And I think it would be interesting to have a discussion today with this broad community. What are the best next steps and how can we best contribute to that? Again, a brief word of thanks because this would all not be possible without our tireless activists, I would like to call them, in the background from the network, and in particular the United Kingdom Office of National Statistics. Richard has taken a leading role and invited many colleagues to the table. but the whole network, of course, under the leadership of Canada and the Maldives and the Bureau members, Indonesia, Netherlands, the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, and of course, my own team. They had frequent meetings in the background to make this all possible. And today I have a special thanks to say to two experts that we have at the table to help us to start this final reflection. So I thank our distinguished speakers, Dr. Atif Kubursi, Professor Emeritus of Economics of McMaster University and a former deputy executive at ESQA, and Ms. Sharon Kochiki, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, that have agreed to share their views on beyond GDP and perhaps give us some inspiration for the way forward. So thanks to all the presenters, but thanks also to all the participants in the background. And it's my pleasure to look forward to this meeting. I'll stay with you and try to make some meaningful concluding remarks at the end. I will listen very carefully. And I invite now Richard, who's been the sort of leading head on most of the sprint, to chair the sessions of today and give us a quick overview of how we do this today. Over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you everyone this morning for joining us. And following Stefan's thanks to the network and our team, I want to particularly thank Benson and Jacqueline on Stefan's staff, who've made a huge contribution, and really these events would not have come together without them. Whilst we're also doing some quick notices, for those of you who are following the revision of the System of National Accounts, Chapter 2 on Wellbeing and Sustainability, the consultation on that is open until the 9th of October, and I will be putting the link to that consultation that chapter, which is out for consultation, in the sidebar shortly. And everyone here has an interest in that topic. I'm sure you'll all be looking at that eagerly, and I know the team are looking to get as many and as varied comments as they can. So please do give a small moment to that. But without anything further from me, we're going to move directly into session 2. We've talked an awful lot about what is beyond GDP. We've talked an awful lot about the details of how we create GDP beyond GDP metrics. But this session is aimed to give us more of a strategic view on how some of our key constituents will use data, will use these indicators, and will think about these in future, whether that is the Global South, as our first speaker, Dr. Atif Kubursi, will hopefully give us a perspective there, or how the large institutional users of traditional GDP and macroeconomic data can make use of these indicators, as Ms. Sharon Kochiki from the Bank of Canada will run through. So without any more from me, I will pass directly to Atif and ask if you would like to share your slides. I'll let you know when we can see them. You're on mute, Atif.
Can I ask you if you would, show the slides as I present? I found it a little bit with Team rather than Zoom.
Certainly.
First of all, I'm delighted. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very happy with what I have read and seen. And our project is a very critical and important one. No question about it. The GDP is an important and widely used, and in some sense, it has been the key indicator that people look to. And even when those who have lots of comments and criticisms have really seen that there is so many correlations of this variable indicator with so many other important aspects of the economy, society, environment, that they can speak to a great extent, focusing on the GDP, yet thinking that it would cover all these other aspects that they consider to be important. Now, your work and the work of so many who felt that the GDP to a great extent does not uh, convey the actual picture, the important aspects that are dear to them and important to them. If we go to the next slide, to a great extent, what we really have here is a situation where people and you people at the UN statistics have really done wonderful job trying to point out some of the weaknesses and some of the missing aspects. But I'm going to repeat very quickly because most of the people present here have done work on this and in many respects uh, way beyond just the minor criticism that come and go, but have done something about it. But very briefly, and I'm going to put my bent on it, is the neglect of quality of life. This is really where economic activity doesn't cover all the aspects and aspirations and the quality of life, so to speak, of citizens. It does not differentiate between activities that enhance when being talking about really health and education, and those that degrade and to a great extent subtract from good life, like pollution, crime, hunger, and other aspects. The issue here is that GDP can rise, but it does not trickle down. And the issue, to some extent, is that we want us to conjure the concept of GDP as if it's made of mercury, that it slips down from the hands of those who get it first, and that each and every one of us, if we are patient, will get some of this growth of the GDP. The trouble is this conception is very much at variance with reality. What we see is that GDP is more like a glue and it tends to stick to the hands of those who first get it. And that Anatole Rappaport, a philosopher, mathematician, had said really talking about a trickle or visible hand, we've always seen it nothing more than a slap on the face. So, to a great extent, there has always been this concern that growth of GDP does not translate into growth or benefit to everybody, and the inequality in the wealth and ability to access uh, the benefits of economic development have been limited in many areas, and to a great extent, if we keep focusing on GDP, we miss all these dysfunctions that have become so crucial, so important, and some have even gone as far to show that inequality is also responsible for some of the health dysfunctions. In some sense, that some mental issues and stresses have really been linked to the inequitable distribution of income and wealth. Next, the other aspect that is important, and this is the one I would focus on today, is the environmental impact of GDP, and this is really the way human activity relates to the generative capacity of nature, that we tend to focus so much on physical capital and not on natural capital, all other types of capital, and all others of poverty. That poverty is not only income poverty, but could be poverty of the spirit, of values, poverty in terms of knowledge, in terms of enjoyment of life and happiness, and so on. All these that came out with some new measures. But the most important aspect that I will really take this morning, I chair a group called the ecological foot global ecological footprint network data foundation, and our job has been, and hopefully today I can go a little bit details with what we do and to tender this as one other aspect of how do we really need and deal with limitations of GDP. But there, I will go into details. But the issue was to what extent can we situate the economy within the biosphere? How do we situate the economy within the social system? So we don't neglect, as some tend to think of the economy as if it is a system independent of all other systems. But to the extent that we use renewable and non-renewable resources, to the extent that we pollute the air, we foul the water. I mean, you can't escape uh, then looking at how the economy relate to the biosphere and to what extent the two have to be taken into account at the same time. And one has to look at them as if they are a joint system, not as separate systems. And then we want to go to the unpaid work and all the aspects that tend to depreciate, particularly the contribution of women and the fact that not everything is just dollars and cents. And if we fail to measure and put and assign a value in dollars and cents, does not mean that that value is not valuable or should not be counted. Next. The other aspects is that, yeah, the UN has done wonderful work. I mean, the HDI goes way beyond GDP, GDP in per capita terms, and its growth, but it also takes years of schooling. So education now is in, and life expectancy is in. So you don't rank countries in terms of their per capita value compared to others, but how do they do on educating their labor force, skilling their labor force, opening the minds of their citizenship, and the life expectancy is that we just don't look at imports, but we look at the outcome of all these concerns about the health and what we do about it. There's a genuine progress index, which is also an important one because there it comes to integrate income distribution and see to what extent the degradation of the environment and how non-market activities can take. So all of these tend to be reactions to what people have considered, and legitimately so, that the GDP fails to reflect and to measure and to communicate the dysfunctions that economies can survive and experience and need to be corrected. The well-being happiness is also fantastic, that in the final end, why do we produce? Why do we consume? Why do we work? Why do we socialize? The issue is ultimately that aspect that we call happiness. And although how difficult it is, although Bhutan is now, taken to be the epitome of that, there is a concern here that we should not just look at dollars and cents, but look at utility, look at happiness, look at satisfaction. All right. All these things are great. Now, what about the environment and why one more thing? And we came up with something we call ecological footprint. And our feeling is that this measure is going to take into account quite a bit of the inclusive growth and the other issue of equitability and even measures of outcome in terms of health and longevity and so on. But the ecological footprint concentrates on measuring really the relationship of human activity to the biosphere, to the environment. We try basically and fundamentally to see to what extent the way we relate to the environment is generating a capacity that is not diminishing the
5 minutes.
future, yeah, the future of generations to enjoy. And it's definitely a concept that is related to overshoot. And our basic fundamental objective here is to show to what extent what we are doing now and what we are enjoying now can be sustained over a long time, can be shared with lots of people, and can not in any way compromise the regenerative capacity of the environment and its ability to absorb and deal with our waste. Next. And the story about the ecological footprint is that it's a quantitative measure. At one time, it came from University of British Columbia, Bill Louise in Canada, and the story was to what extent, if we produce negatives, what should we do produce? Like how many trees, if the bad is the carbon dioxide, how many trees? What sort of global hectares would we have to earmark on the side? So what?
Que disseram os jogadores da zona mística do Fluminense, Fernando Diniz, que ele mudou a história
If
do
we
jogo.
can keep microphones on mute, please.
O John Arias se emocionando.
Atif, please continue.
Yeah. So the story here is the extent to which we can subtract from the GDP or from our physical capital that amount of resources that would be necessary to absorb all the waste and the negatives that we spout out of our chimneys and from our factories and from our cars. The story here is to what extent can we give a quantitative measure, a measure that could be globally used, that is not so much centric to a one nation developed or developing, to a Asian rather than to a Latin American. I mean, the beauty about the ecological footprint, it is scalable. It can be used at any level. We have generated these numbers for large number of countries. I'll show you next, please. So it's to a great extent, it's a comprehensive assessment of the human impact on the environment. And it accounts not only for resource consumption, but also goes to the emissions that come from economic activity. And how these activities and waste that they generate in the production and use and survival become valuable tools for understanding the overall burden that we people impose on the environment. Next. And the issue here is to what extent we can use this global metric to compare how countries really want to others who are looking more sustainable or living more sustainably, or in a more important way, are in a position to look at the overshoot, and the overshoot where our economic activity is now out of proportion of what the environment and the carrying capacity and the regenerative capacity of environment is able to sustain. And that really is a very important measure, because this deficit, it becomes a way in which we could compare and identify sustainability of a particular activity, community, or country, or even globally. I mean, our numbers have shown that at the level we're going right now, we need 1.7 planets of the type that we have in order to live sustainably. The overshoot is really large, and there are really ways and imperatives and necessary steps that we need to take in order to bring these into some sort of balance. Next, the footprint is not a theoretical concept, but we have literally been applied, and we have about 247 territories to which it's been applied, and it uses data and has been done and on a consistent basis between 1961 and 2022. we were a little bit lagging behind because data is not available all the time to the current year. We're now using nowcasting instead of backcasting, nowcasting, so that in a way we do not sit back 3 or 4 years because people are very much
2
concerned
minutes.
that they would need these things. The issue here is to what extent can we persuade the United Nations? Can we persuade governments that it becomes a useful tool that can be generated on a continuous and a robust basis so that countries can adopt these measures, use them for their own purposes, and as tools to raise red flags and warning flags about our non-sustainable life. And it also embedded in it, there are incredible amount of information and insights of what would make a country more sustainable and how far is it from sustainability and how can we close this gap and what transformation action can we take in order to close this gap next. And here, my purpose is to a great extent with you people and the professional and have done a wonderful jobs in moving into SIA, the system of economic environmental accounts, and how can we integrate this concept of ours, which is not only flow but also stocks of flow, and it's not physical capital but also natural capital. So there are aspects to this system that jibes well with SIA, and I am arguing here is how can we work together? How can we make this tool? We're working from the university, from York University in Canada, and we generate these results on a consistent basis. And we have a team of researchers, professors, students. It has become now a training center for statisticians who would work to look at this aspect. Next, I'll try to conclude very quickly. We use a lot of UN data, whether the FAO, production statistics, resource statistics, fishing statistics. We look at UNCTAD, Comtrade, World Bank, IEA. I mean, what we try to do here is to synthesize so much data. Most of it comes from you guys, and we depend so heavily on what you produce. And then we have a scientific committee that has generated algorithms that could purify, can find ways of making sure that the numbers jibe, that they are of high quality, that they're missing variables, we're able to supply and provide this. Next, and the thing that we think is quite useful is it can inform and can supply supporting things for the SDG 12 footprint consumption and production relate to capacity of the ecosystem, and that's the most important thing. And here, identifying overshoot and deficit in SDG 13, it accounts and incorporates emissions and that draw down on natural capital and land cover, and what would be the best way, because we talk about net zero, but nobody is spending enough time to tell us really how do we go into net zero, what is the critical path, and if there exists alternatives, how and which one of these alternatives is probably more consistent with the logic and the objective of being into net zero. And we go into SDG 4 and 15, and the issue here is we relate in a very specific and direct way, and in a accounting framework where how we can contribute to the assessment and the realization and the way the SDGs can be implemented. Next, and I'm done. Next one will be done. What we need here is basically to see what is really needed and what should be needed, and how we can identify lack of sustainability, but at the same time put the people who are looking at this in a position where they can address what would take to implement movement towards sustainability, movement towards net zero, moving towards a life where we can live with nature and what we borrowed from it is not really squandered or not repaid. Thank you.
Thank you, Atif. Thank you. A great tour there through this issue. I'm going to move us straight on to Sharon. Sharon, would you like to share your slides, and then we'll take a few questions at the end. I see we started to get questions already, but please do enter questions in the sidebar as they come to you. So Sharon, over to you.
Well, first, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak with this group. My slides are not all that detailed, so but they'll provide hopefully a very brief outline of what I'm going to say. So my talk today is from the point of view of a central bank. So that's a really important starting point, because I'm going to be telling you the sorts of information that we use along the way. So in Canada, monetary policy targets 2% inflation. By achieving this low, stable, and predictable level of inflation, monetary policy can best promote the economic and financial well-being of Canadians. And so GDP is an anchor point in our analysis, because supply and demand really matter for evaluating the outlook for inflation, but GDP is only the tip of the iceberg. So I'm going to start now by, let's see if I can get this going. So I'll start with the production side of the economy and why we go beyond GDP when we're assessing the economic outlook. The underlying structural drivers of growth feed into our estimates of potential output, and that anchors our views on supply and long-run sustainable growth. And as I mentioned, the supply-demand balance is an important driver of inflation. So traditionally, we've used concepts like labor, capital, and productivity to assess potential output. Now, for labor, it's not just about the number of hours of labor input. Worker training and skills matter too. Investment in human capital pays off by supporting labor productivity and raising sustainable growth. It can contribute to higher wages and improved standards of living. Now, the growth of the labor force is also important, and the speed at which this occurs depends on population growth, labor force participation, and socio-demographic factors related to aging. In Canada, population growth is largely driven by inflows of new permanent and non-permanent residents. And the inflow of new residents has fluctuated quite a bit since the start of the pandemic. And this has affected both our estimates of potential growth and also our interpretations of GDP growth. Now, on the labor productivity side, we've traditionally looked at how investment and innovation feed into physical capital and other drivers of productivity growth. But evaluating future trends is really becoming more complicated. Looking ahead, it'll be important to think about how Canada's net zero timeline is going to impact investment and productivity, and how the structure of the economy could change. And more frequent climate events could disrupt production and lead to a reevaluation of supply chains. At the same time, deglobalization and digitalization could have important implications for productivity, but the extent of their effects is still unknown. So let me turn to the demand side of the economy. Now, aggregate data tells a story of averages, but no household or firm is ever truly average. Household heterogeneity is important, and experiences differ depending on household income, indebtedness, and stage of life. So we need to understand these differences because they can matter in assessing the impacts of economic shocks and also of our policies. So people are exposed to recessions to different degrees. Now, low-income workers have historically been more likely to lose their jobs in a downturn, and income inequality has typically risen in past recessions. Now, low-income workers also tend to consume more of their income. So all else equal, consumption by low-income households is more likely to fall during an economic shock and more likely to fall proportionately more. And that's just one illustration of why distributional information is so important. And so individual experiences can differ considerably from what the aggregate data set says. And that's why one of the reasons why we look at diverse sources of information, surveys and microdata on the labor market, as well as distributions of household economic accounts for income, consumption, savings, and wealth. Now, at the bank, we've been investing in our ability to do this for years, and it has really paid some major dividends. Our ability to examine the economy at a granular level has guided our policy response to the challenging events of the past few years. Now, one example is our examination of how households of different socio-demographic characteristics and income levels experienced the pandemic. We developed a dashboard of labor market indicators, which helped us assess pandemic recovery and whether it was even across groups. Now, over the past year and a half, we've been raising the policy interest rate. We've also been very mindful of how this time is very different from past business cycles. There's a pandemic paradox of accumulated debt and accumulated wealth, and this has been a really key consideration. So the combination of elevated savings and pent-up demand can mean that households have more desire and ability to spend, and that means rising interest rates could have little effect on their spending. But the other side of this paradox is that when households have a lot of debt, their spending is more sensitive to rising interest rates. And household debt in Canada is at an all-time high. So some households are less sensitive to rising interest rates, while others are more sensitive. We also need to be aware that special circumstances can merit a deeper dive into the data. And so, for instance, even though survey data has told us that many households are struggling, consumption growth in Canada was very strong in the first quarter. Now, pandemic-specific drivers such as pent-up demand and delayed delivery of goods contributed to strong consumption growth. But at the same time, a surge in population growth linked to inflows of new permanent and non-permanent residents seemed a likely contributor. And then again, we've investigated how different socioeconomic characteristics and behavior of these two sources of population growth compared with the rest of the population. Now, and by understanding how different groups experience the economy, we can do a better job of forecasting where it is heading, and that helps us balance risks. So now I'd like to turn to some recent research that's contributed to our understanding of the Canadian economy. Now, economists increasingly draw on microdata and an arsenal of analytic techniques and models. And the microdata has been vital to understanding household spending and debt, firm pricing behavior, and labor market developments. Now, one recent development is a new agent-based model of the Canadian economy that we have at the bank. It's called Canvas. And now it uses detailed information about economic agents, including using the input-output tables for the industrial structure of the Canadian economy. And that allows the model to highlight the complex interactions, which ultimately lead to movements in the aggregate data. Now, it's not just about heterogeneity or traditional measures of economic activity. Now, bank research suggests that uncertainty generates significant changes in some activities not captured by consumption expenditures. Home production is a great example of this. And so while home production isn't measured by the standard national accounts, this variation is welfare relevant, and it's central to households' labor supply and savings decisions during times of heightened uncertainty. So in this context, measures of well-being are extremely useful for capturing what matters to people and how assessing this might affect their behavior. So for example, we know that GDP tends to outpace measures of well-being, confirming that a good life is not just about income. And it's important to consider how this will influence choices between work and leisure and what impact that will have on labor productivity. So let me close with a few remarks on some areas for ongoing development. First, data sets that link micro and macro information can provide an enhanced starting point for understanding current economic developments and predicting future ones. The system of national accounts can be used as a reference point for the incorporation of this new information into macroeconomic policy. Now, second, international comparability is essential. Now, this is not just about comparing outcomes. It's also about facilitating learning from different experiences across countries and regions, as well as monitoring potential spillovers across borders. Third, the state of the world's natural capital is important to the debate on sustainable growth. Natural capital has sometimes been thought of as remaining fixed over time, but climate change is challenging this assumption and could have ramifications for how we estimate potential output. Finally, the evolution of human capital is key for assessing potential output growth. Our economic models assume that consumers and firms weigh their expectations of the future when they take decisions. Now, our research suggests that between 1997 and 2018, human capital's contribution to Canada's GDP growth was close to 20%. Now, that said, we know very little about the drivers of human capital growth. Measuring it's a challenge since efficiency units cannot be directly observed. To assess future growth and potential output, we need a more robust understanding of human capital, and improved metrics would help central banks conduct monetary policy, as potential output is a key factor in decision making. Now, perhaps even more importantly, human capital and productivity are critical to enhancing our standards of living. And in the end, this is really what we all want. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we are open to questions, and I see we already have some questions in the sidebar. So I'm going to start with Paul Allen. Paul, would you like to come in and ask your question?
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to the two speakers. They were really, really helpful. I put my question in when Atif was talking. He was painting a great picture of why we need new metrics and those that are already available. But he did use the phrase they could be used, and I just wanted to kind of hear a bit more about, in a sense, how they're already being used and how they could be used differently from now on. Now, of course, then Sharon very kindly kind of gave a view of how a central bank uses that information, but there are many more players than central banks. So Atif, I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about kind of moving from measurement to action, please. Thank you.
Shall I answer now, or would it take more questions?
Let's take that one, and then I'll bring in the others.
No, excellent question. And actually, we have several uses. And our aim ultimately is to move from data, from information into action, into programs. And you're absolutely right. These numbers remain abstract until we get governments and institutions and groups to use them. We, as I said, is scalable. I mean, I just was in a meeting yesterday, and I sat next to a priest, and apparently one of his parishioners have taken stock of where does and what's the ecological footprint of the parish. And he was very excited about it. And in some sense, he was saying that I did not know that we fouled the environment at this level. I mean, the issue, I hope that he would take this to mean that we need as individuals to incorporate or to change our behavior and to modify the way we relate to the environment in a way that would make us more sustainable by being in a position to reduce our ecological footprint. Several countries have already used. Now we have Iceland, and they have been active and trying to see in what ways and in what level of activities that we could tender and propose, they can do it. But our aim, and this is really where we're coming to you at the UN, that the credibility, the usefulness of this is going to depend to a great extent on buyout, how people will buy, in using this. And the hope is that, look, I mean, ours now is very critical, the ecological footprint, because we are all suffering. I mean, it's no longer a theoretical expectation that climate change is going to mean some major catastrophic event. And the issue is to what extent ecological footprint is going to lead to a more proper mitigation and invite and challenge people into more resiliency and adaptation programs. So the issue at the end, how can we really move from numbers and information into action and programs? and you're absolutely right of this. I would like to see it a lot more. It would get more the more we get different groups, and particularly the UN, to see some value in it and to work together on it.
Thank you. And so I was going to bring now in Hassan Aini. I hope I've got your name around the right way. It's often not very clear on Teams surnames and first names. But Hassan, did you want to address your question to Sharon?
Yes, thank you, Richard. Thank you for this session and very informative sessions that you had earlier also. My question is about what Professor Atif mentioned about the ecological footprint. I have actually two questions. One is written there, and in the chat box, it's about the sustainability that has three dimensions of environment, economy, and social. But I think that when we use this ecological footprint, we are leaving out the social aspect of the sustainability. That was my first question. And the second question is about the applicability of calculating something like ecological footprint for different countries. I've been using data for carbon or water footprints in Iran, for example, calculating how the diet of different populations are using different or producing different carbon footprints or water footprints, but the data that I was using are coming from developed countries. The life cycle of the products from different countries are different, and even in the country like urban and rural, consider, for example, the dairy products, that the life cycle of the dairy products in rural areas are different from those in urban areas. So when we want to calculate something like footprint for carbon or water, it will be complicated and very data demanding, and calculation and estimation of these data or production of these data will be very different. So that's why my second question is about what is the approach and what is the recommendations for this data demanding measure. Thank you.
Thank you. Sharon or Atif, either you want to tackle that one?
I'd like to mention he raised two extremely important issues. The first one is, does the footprint take into account social aspects? I mean, there is nothing called sustainable. There is nothing called a proper functioning of human activity that does not take into account not only the economic aspects and the health aspects and the social aspects. I mean, the issue of sustainability is the integration and the overlap of every single aspect. So you do not go and subsume any aspect. So the ecological footprint takes into account these things in a number of ways. The way the society is organized, the way it deals with education. To a great extent, we believe that one of the major functions of EF, the ecological footprint accounting, is an education tool. An education tool in the sense that it would raise awareness about what is sustainable life, and to what extent each and every one of us is living sustainably. It's also about ultimately trying to share the burden. Like if we are 1.7 planets when we only have one planet, and we don't even have planet B. I know Musk might eat his words, but the trouble is we have to live on this planet, and we want to make sure that we live and make sure that our children, grandchildren live. There is a corollary to it that has come to be known as degrowth. But here, degrowth doesn't mean zero growth for everybody. You can't ask the industrial West, with all its advancement and all the wealth it has created, that it should really have the same level of growth, while others who have never had the chance to advance their life should really partake into this reduction of growth. We need an equitable way of distributing the burden of responsibility here. And this is totally social. In some sense, the global south is not going to be asked to do the same that the global north. I mean, I work in a region called MENA, which has lots of oil and tremendous worries about this oil and gas and what they contribute and being stranded assets. But the whole region contributes 4% to total emissions. And one would think to some extent, particularly those poor countries there that will not produce oil, I mean, they are in a very vulnerable position. Just as we were planning for this, major catastrophes happened in Libya with the major floods, the earthquake in Syria and in Morocco. And social systems are absolutely the most important fallback. I mean, one of the most heartening things we've seen in Morocco is that communities became, every kitchen became a community kitchen. They shared food, they shared roofs, they shared whatever clothes they have. So to a great extent, the resilience and mitigation and dealing with the overshoot is a social responsibility as well as an individual responsibility. And the greater the social solidarity and the social programs that you could come to deal with these would be fantastically needed. It would be critical.
I see that there's been an exchange in the sidebar between Ivo and Sharon, who's asked a question. I see Stefan's put his hand up, so I'll probably let Stefan have the last question as we need to keep moving. I'm very mindful of our speaker's time, but Stefan.
No, apologies, Richard. I know you're trying to manage time, but it's so fascinating. So thank you to the two speakers. I have a specific question perhaps to Sharon. I mean, first of all, I should say thank you to Sharon twice. First of all, for mentioning the importance of international information. I mean, as a director of global statistics, I'm also very happy. And you mentioned not only the numbers themselves, but the ability to learn from each other, that international numbers are also sort of a pact of solidarity in terms of understanding the world around us. So thank you for that. But also the second thank you is for restoring my faith into users, because we sometimes, as good statisticians, think all our users cannot really digest all of our numbers. And you've been laying out an amazing breadth of numbers that you are actually using when you're taking decisions. In this context, I have two questions. I mean, do you think there's really a limit that users can digest? That goes back to our discussion of whether we should do composite indexes or dashboards, and if we do dashboards, should we have 10, 20 or 50 indicators? Where is the limits of what users can really digest? Do you have any views on that? And then the second, if there's any single number that you would like to have on Canada that you don't have, and you stumble over it and only think all the time, I wish I knew ... What would it be?
Wow, that's tough. I wish I knew. So let me pause on that one. I think the idea in terms of dashboards and multiple indicators is just, are there ways that we can extract information in a straightforward and simple way? So it's not necessarily is there a limitation to the number of indicators? Because we're now dealing with microdata that is, remarkably fine, but any one piece of data is not going to be telling us very much. So we need to really understand, a broader context, and that means we need to think of ways to aggregate it. And I'm going to give you one little example. In the middle of the recovery from the pandemic, we wanted to see how the labor market was doing, and we put together a dashboard that had, I don't know, roughly 40 indicators on it, and we had them grouped into different components. And some of the indicators were things like, employment of 15 to 25-year-olds, employment of 60-plus-year-olds. So we had male, we had female, so we had all sorts of different cuts. But the way that we organized the data to get a sense was we had what we would call a flower chart. And the very center of the flower was the worst that indicator had been in the pandemic. And then the outside of the flower was, in a sense, where things had been in 2019, right before everything hit. And so you could very quickly look at that chart that had tons of bars on it going inside out to see how things were recovering towards where they'd been pre-pandemic. If you really wanted, you could then get a quick snapshot looking at these three different components, one of which was sort of the evenness of the recovery, one of which was sort of more quality of the recovery, so that would be more like wages and things like that. And so there were just these different broad indicators, but it was remarkable how quick, just by eyeballing it and even squinting so you couldn't see the labels, you got a sense of the recovery. And I think that's what the key thing is as we go forward. Just again, that's just one example. But as we go forward, figuring out how we can process a lot of information into the key messages that we're most interested in. And so that's where I would come down, that again, the analysis is not just about getting the data, but learning from the data. And that's where, to a certain extent, the statistical agencies are going to be wanting to facilitate our access to the data. And for a large number of typical users, providing, hey, here are things you might be interested in, because you can learn a lot by looking at these dashboards. But for other users, it might be, and here's the behind the scenes data, because you may want to be developing on your own, visualizations or deeper analysis that will help your specific need. And so I think that's where I would come down on that. Yeah, I haven't in the meantime been able to come up with that one single indicator. I think that really is a tough one. And I think one of the things that I've learned over my years in central banking is, once you think you have a framework, the future will tell you your framework's not rich enough, right? And so you're going to be or the framework you've developed is the right framework for the shocks of the past. And you need to be thinking about the future. So in that sense, all of our models are always evolving through time. And this is a natural thing for me to say as statisticians, because clearly our measure of national accounts evolves through time as the economy evolves through time. And so I think that's the strength of a lot of behind the scenes work that the statistical agencies are doing, or putting together the frameworks for what we need to know to be, setting policies in the future. There was some things in the chat. I'm going to throw some links in there to save some time. We've done a lot of work related to climate that's useful for things like financial risk analysis, and we're developing some macro models. We don't have a lot of public information on the macro models currently under development, but for the financial side, I can provide some links. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you both for a really informative session there. As you say, that there's a few questions still in the sidebar, so if you're able to stick around for a bit and to answer any of those in the side, that'd be fantastic. But now I'm going to call Ivo Havinga to join me, because I need to be presenting the next session, so I need someone to keep me to time. So Ivo, are you there?
Yeah. Oh, am I coming on?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, good, excellent. Well, good morning, and thank you for, again, also from my side, from the excellent sort of keynote speeches that we had on these matters. They were very informative and really set us up very well. In the next session, we will go in more sort of deeper understanding of what we actually have done. And in pole position, being done in terms of the second sprint, which was held this year across 6 prior sprint meetings or sessions, as we call them. And I first turn to Richard to start off the discussion. Richard.
Excellent. Can you confirm you can see the slides, Ivo?
Yes, yeah. Confirm.
Fabulous. So I'm going to spend a quick 15 minutes or so recapping on the work we have done as a collective, and just putting some of that into context, into a longer term context. As this is our second set of sprints, as well as the 6 this year, we also did 5 last year. And I wanted to look across that set of work and to consider where it is taking us and where what it potentially has told us. And as before, I apologise for my cough. So very much, as Stefan laid out, our starting point was the UN's Our Common Agenda document and its explicit reference to the need to take collective actions in this space and to come together as a body to think about how we could establish strong pathways to create the types of data that we can all, I think, following our keynote speakers, see the necessity of, recognizing the huge value of the investment which has been made over the last 20, 30 years and beyond. So the network established, this is one of our first sprint series. So we were very much testing the sprint model as well as challenging the question of beyond GDP. And our aim throughout has been to give an opportunity to a wide variety of speakers to bring their thoughts to bear, to give a wide community the opportunity to ask questions and to challenge and explore in greater depth. So I would broadly characterize 4 key steps in this journey. In 2022, we broadly asked ourselves the question, what is beyond GDP? Recognizing the wide variety of work which had been undertaken, the different natures of that, excuse me, the heritage of that, which led to us providing a research prospectus in late 2022 to the 2023 UN Statistical Commission, which I'm going to say a little bit about, which then took us into this series, thinking more about how we're delivering beyond GDP and what are some of the key data and attributes we've been using. And obviously our aim will be to be thinking about, in the light of that information, what do we want to propose to the 2024 Statistics Commission in terms of next steps. And I think very much this session, this sprint today, is helping us. The aim ultimately is to help us to begin to coalesce some thoughts on what our collective view is in terms of the road forward from here. So 2022, we've rehearsed this a couple of times, but those who are relatively more fresh to our group, I think our key findings were just the scale of the amount of material. It's a long and rich history of work in this area that's delivered huge amounts of work. But if there's a failure, it's a failure for us to then down select from that wide variety of items a core group which can then inform in commonality decisions across a wide variety of questions. And in part, the barriers that were holding us back from drawing together that core set of metrics was some essential barriers, huge variation in available data. Even within the most developed economies, not all of us produce the same types of extending data that go beyond the cores of national accounts and GDP. Obviously, a lack of a common language. In the UK context, we often talk about health and well-being, but well-being is not just a subset of health. And the fact that we were trying to reach across a wide variety of communities. One attendee who flagged that I never realized my work on well-being was part of what you called beyond GDP, the need for us to bring communities together very clearly as a key issue, and simply the fact that we were all approaching these questions in very different ways. Some of us talk about well-being, some of us think about it in terms of inclusion, some of us think about sustainability, some of us have preferences for dashboards, some of us see merits in composite indices, some of us want to focus on subjective measures of well-being, some of us are more interested in some of the objective measures, all of which suggested we had to do significant community building and bring together a commonality of language to help us take the debate forward. And equally, I think one of the key things we found was that users definitely want to see a map or have a means of navigating through the options which are available to them so they can find the right variable for their particular question. So the research prospectus came forward with essentially two core proposals. One was that whilst we have very strong standards around national accounts and environmental accounting, there's maybe less commonality or less of a high level view in relation to population and social data, and a lot of that data is absolutely integral to the work we're trying to do. And if one is looking to draw data consistently from across social, environmental and economic domains, one needs to have a clarity of a framework under which you're doing that, which allows you to actually get a rounded picture of inclusive and sustainable well-being. And I think the second key thing we identified was that the world is not standing still on this topic. There is a lot of work which is moving forward. I've already flagged to you the consultation from the S&A chapter on wellbeing and sustainability. It's vitally important that we keep building on the incremental value being delivered by these different proposals, different areas. And that keeping pace with that actually is hugely challenging, as can be seen by the fact that when we started the 2022 sprint, we never envisaged there'd be a need for a 2023 sprint, let alone 6 sessions of it. So to give you a picture of what the proposal would be that we put forward and that was supported at the Commission, it would be looking at how on the social side we achieve something more like the S&A and the SEER, bringing together the very many strong and high quality guidances and manuals that exist in that space to give us a really strong anchor point to then populate the framework for inclusive sustainable well-being, which would look to include that central dashboard of a core set of well-being indicators, explore where new composite indices may benefit in that space, and then produce disaggregations from an inclusion and a sustainability point of view, ensuring we capture the capitals component here. So jumping into the sessions we've had this year, we had our first session effectively brought people up to date on the latest state of the work, and really core contributions here from Francesca Groom, who's going to speak next and give us an update on the work of the new group, the Friends of the Chair on Social and Demographic Statistics. Really important contributions from Catherine Van Rompuy and Jurrit Schrimberg, who have taken us through where the S&A has reached in this debate and the contribution that they believe that the S&A will be able to make into this discussion. Stephen McFeely, Rafael Diaz de Medina took us through the potential to seek greater coherence through bringing together measures of social statistics, and Oliver Chingawa gave us a perspective on this from Africa and thinking about how we use a range of indicators across beyond the traditional coverage. Sprint 2 then gave us an opportunity to really explore the UN's Our Common Agenda and its follow-up report valuing what counts. Anu Peltola from UNCTAD took us through that material. Rutger Hoekstra, who will speak later, talked to us about Europe's contribution in this area and the Horizon project, along with Jonathan Barth, who is alongside him on some of that work. Gerard Edding from Netherlands took us through how to think about the Brundtland principles of here and now in the future, and now and elsewhere when thinking about well-being. Cleanna Taylor from the UK took us through how we can bring together different types of capital data and think more imaginatively in this space. And Graciela Marquez gave us a roundup of how in Mexico, delivery of the satellite accounts has helped them to fulfill and deliver a far wider perspective than just the core national accounts outputs. Session 3 took us into a very much new area, which was environmental, social and governance data, led by Sonia Rezan from Statistics Canada. So Richard Barker from the ISSB took us through the core of what their proposals are in terms of guidance on how to report metrics and bring these together. Vincent Seigerink focused on how we use the concepts of well-being, particularly at the micro as well as the macro level, to align and bring together this new ESG data with the data that we're more traditionally used to using from households and traditional surveys. Helen Slinger gave us a view from the business accounting community, who, if we want to use ESG data, really are key in as a new data supplier for us. Excuse me. Jan Emmanuel Deneve gave us the views of using crowdsourced surveys and calculating work happiness scores. So actually thinking about how work and the contribution of people at work, how the work affects their well-being, and then how that state of the employee workforce is linked to financial and stock market performance for companies. Samir Trabelski talked about how we could link ESG data with GDP and the need, reinforcing the need for universally and comparable standards in the ESG space. And then Sonia brought this together, looking at Statistics Canada experimental dashboard, which leverages existing data and shows what an NSI can do in this space. Excuse me. Sprint 4, led by Eleanor Rees from the UK, took us into a snapshot of the current state of wellbeing dashboards as operated in many different countries. So Diana Cook and Mariolette Lotter from New Zealand gave us a perspective of both their shorter treasury-based framework and their longer framework, bigger dashboard, which takes account of Indigenous populations and different viewpoints. And really importantly, one of the things I noted there was that didn't take humans as the center, as the focal point. It very much looks at the environment and humanity's place within that environment as the structure around that framework. Eleanor presented the work in the UK, where we've recently republished and relaunched our National Wellbeing Dashboard. Dasho Kama Ura from Bhutan talked us through Bhutanese Gross National Happiness Index and the 33 measures and 9 domains that present a scale of deeply happy through to unhappy. Carrie Wolanski from Statistics Canada gave us a picture of Canada's Quality of Life Hub, which uses 85 measures across its 5 domains. Carrie Exton showed us how the OECD has been bringing this together into the Better Life Index. And Amit Yaga-Kroll from Israel has brought us together up to date with the UNECE's work, which has looked to survey these and begin to identify, are there common domains, are there common variables which multiple territories, multiple nations are using to understand their well-being. Overall, I think from this we drew a sense of the range of options and very much the variation in the way people have tackled this question. Sprint 5, led by Ivo and Tim Miller, took us into distributional frameworks, and here we really are able to stand on the shoulders of some very, very advanced work from the national transfer accounts, which Alexia Thern-Katzwetz from Vienna took us through. Jurit Zwinberg returned to talk to us about the OECD's work on household distributional accounts and looking at how that joins with national accounts work in this territory. Lucas Chancel talked us through the Paris School's work on distributional national accounts. Yang Chung Zhang from UNDP talked to us about the Human Development Index, which is a slightly different way of thinking about inclusion. Before Piedad Urdanola and Eduardo Rios Neto gave us an overview and a synergy looking across these frameworks and thinking about what they have in common and where they differ, and the complementarity between these. The synergies and complementarity between these, I think, are very clear for many of us to see when we look at them, that there's the opportunity here to use these frameworks to actually give a very rich and varied picture of inclusion and inclusion statistics across these variables. Finally, on to Sprint 6, Apologies, I've just managed to hide some of the words behind the logo there in the corner. This was looking at the relative benefit and trade-offs between dashboards and composite indices. So I gave a brief summary of some of the key options and variables available to us, highlighting the key documents from the OECD and the UNEC in this space. Leonard Nakamura from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia took us through his work on using time as a weighting mechanism. Many of us are familiar with using things like money or prices, but time is a very is another way of looking, another lens to look at this problem. Khalid Abu Ismail from EXQA talked about Human Development Challenges report and stressed the two principles that he had used about thinking about indicators which reflected something of intrinsic value, but which also had a low correlation with GDP. And I think that's an interesting question to pose for ourselves. Is GDP a measure of welfare? Is it a weak measure of welfare? You know, that's probably my position, because of all the things it excludes. As economists, probably we think that all measures of prices and volume have some importance in this space, but finding those things which are distinct from GDP does help to widen our lens quite considerably. Amit Kapoor from India talked about the Social Progress Index and the opportunities to give this gives to understand well-being at a more disaggregated level. Cleanna Taylor talked about the new composite indices we call inclusive income, which we have produced here in the UK. And William Muhwava from UNECA talked about how data from the MPI, alongside a variety of microdata, can be used to calculate multidimensional measures of poverty in Africa, but where there's a continued need to collect more data and add employment data so that we can better calculate economic activities by member countries. So where does that take us in terms of overall findings? So these are very much mine. I'm sure other members of the task team working on this will have their own thoughts and views, and so you may or may not see these reflected in our final report. But I think for me, key findings are the richness of the landscape around national wellbeing dashboards, the variety in their size and design, the need to take account domestic priorities which shape those local frameworks, how much of those frameworks actually are shared in common, and a question here on how we move beyond well-being in the here and now, which is often the focus of many existing well-being dashboards, to consider more inclusion and sustainability issues, but also how we could capture ESG data better. I think alongside this, we see a growing acceptance that the measurement of subjective well-being has reached a developed state as a scientific discipline, and that actually there is real merit in thinking about how we can lean into that and potentially use that as the tip of as the peak of a pyramid that builds upon policy-facing measures of objective well-being that can inform how why subjective well-being is changing, and equally rely on measures of sustainable capitals to understand how that will look moving into the future. Equally, excuse me, from the inclusion perspective, that we have three strong front-running distributional frameworks when we're thinking about consumption, income and wealth along things like HDI and other metrics, which means that we can get quite a subtle and well-developed perspective of inclusive well-being here and elsewhere, and that equally there are strong front-running measures of capital which are, I believe, becoming increasingly well-developed, and which, whilst they do present some material differences, we can see why that is in the methodologies that they use, and that again gives us a really strong foundation for understanding well-being now and into the future. And finally, that both dashboards and composite indices struggle with this common challenge of understanding and presenting trade-offs, and actually work on one is likely to help us improve the other, and they're probably not in competition with each other in quite the way we maybe thought they were when we started on the sprint series. And so, Ivo, I will pass back to you and pause there.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard, for providing this great overview. It shows the richness of again this sprint series that we had, and thank you for bringing that back. I think it is important for us to recall, and thank you also for bringing these conclusions together that really reflect our discussions as we have among ourselves. So thank you for bringing that forward as well. I'd like to move to Francesca also for the interest of time. Francesca Groom is a dear colleague or ex-colleague from me. I'm retired now, but she is now heading social demographic division in UNSD. And she is in charge as secretariat of the work of the Friends of the Chair on Social Demographic Statistics, which we take a keen interest in as a network, as we have been exploring the development of, a continuation of an old discussion on the system of population and social statistics. Francesca, we would look forward to your update on where the Friends of the Chair is and see how we can network in the future. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ivo. Can you just confirm that you see my slides? I only have one screen, so I lose you all. Give me a sign if I'm talking for too long. Thank you, and it's very nice to be back after a few months. I was one of the presenters at the first sprint, and I'm also very happy to have this opportunity to bring back the social dimension of well-being in our discussion on coming up with metrics of progress going beyond the GDP. So I will indeed talk about the work of the Friends of the Chair group on social and demographic statistics. That's a new initiative, a new mechanism established by the UN Statistical Commission, asked to take stock of where we stand in terms of progress towards better statistics on social and demographic issues. And it has also been asked to come up with recommendations over the next couple of years for improved statistics in this very broad space. But before doing that, I would like to quickly recall the discussion and my presentation at the first sprint, because at that point we took stock of the many initiatives and the many attempts at the UN Statistical Commission to conceptualize and to systematize social statistics to better measure well-being and quality of life. So I think it's very important to always take a stock into the past, to learn from the past as we define our future directions, and also very much in line with what Stefan mentioned at the beginning, right? Let's look back before we look forward. So let's see. Very quickly, this is just one slide. It's just a visual of what was, apologies, presented during the first sprint. And it's really an overview of discussions and decisions at the UN Statistical Commission since 1947. So many attempts to develop social and demographic statistics and measuring well-being, starting with the first report on levels of living in 1954 that proposed a component approach, so looking at 12 thematic areas touching on all aspects of life. From that time, we jumped into the 1970s, where Mr. Stone proposed the development of a system of social and demographic statistics, SSDS, trying to mimic, try to replicate the success of a system of national accounts, but in the social statistics domain. That didn't fly at the time. Maybe it was too complex for the 70s. There was a proposal a few years later, lighter proposal, relying on a framework for social and demographic statistics, but all of that was somehow put aside in the 90s when there was what we call a momentum for the social indicators movement. So the first set of social indicators or indicator dashboard that was the minimum national social data set in 1995. We had other attempts later on, and of course that bring us into the recent history for most of us with the Millennium Development Goals indicators in 2001, and now our Sustainable Development Goals indicators as of 2017. So today we are 2023. The Commission has established this new mechanism, the Friends of the Chair group, and who is working to come up with recommendations on how to strengthen the social and demographic statistics pillar. Of course, very much building on existing related initiatives. So we are looking at the work of in the revision of the system of national account that is due by 2025. And as Richard also mentioned, there is a full chapter on well-being, and we are also part of that discussion. We want to learn and build on the discussion, ongoing discussion on the beyond GDP. And of course, we are also very much attuned and getting ready to make sure that the recommendations that will be prepared in the next 2 years can fit into whatever comes after 2030. So we want to make sure that the social dimension and the data needs will be properly reflected. So, but the Friends of the Chair, again, very quickly was established in 2022 with the key mandates of reviewing in depth the social and demographic statistics pillar, and to come up, as I said, in a couple of years, by 2026, with a set of recommendations to establish statistical system that better reflect society, so better integrating this very broad space that comprises the social concerns, as well as to better reflect society and its connections with environment and the economy. In terms of members and observers, this is just for your knowledge, we are working with 10 member states, 10 chief statisticians, Canada, Colombia, Denmark, Hungary, Indonesia, Lithuania, Mexico, Poland, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. And Hungary and Mexico are our co-chairs. We also have very active observers. We have our experts from the 5 UN regional commissions, and also experts, the chief statisticians from selected specialized agencies, WHO, we have ILO, we have UNESCO, we have our colleagues from OECD, and we have our colleagues from the population division, our demographers in DESA. So in terms of what we are doing, our problem statement is how do we make social and demographic statistics fit for purpose today, as well as for the future. And of course, the group, the FOC group has met already over a few months. And the first task ahead was really to highlight the current challenges faced by social demographic statistics. First of all, there was taking stock of the fact that we lack an overarching conceptual framework to better organize this very broad statistical space. There is also the acknowledgement that it's more complex, it's more difficult to model social phenomena compared to other phenomena, maybe like economic ones. We are also facing critical issues because on one end, we are asked to produce data that are much more granular. So we are asked to come up with a lot of disaggregations. for vulnerable groups, for geographic, etc. And we are asked to produce data in a more timely and more frequent manners, while on the other side, we see that we are working in a very tight fiscal environment, so the resources are limited. And we also see that our respondents are experiencing a fatigue. You probably know that when we measure social phenomena, most of our information comes from household surveys, and unfortunately, there is a significant decline in response rates. So how do we balance all these elements so that we can still produce high quality and highly disaggregated data within the resources that are allocated to the social and demographic statistics pillar? Of course, the space is super broad. I'm not talking about the themes, but I assume that everybody here is quite familiar. We touched about health, about work, about education, but there is so much more. We talk about social connections, social cohesion, about trust. We talk about housing, we talk about population, we talk about work-life balance, we talk about gender equality, the rights of migrants and persons with disabilities. This is all part of our portfolio. And to make all these bits and pieces connected, of course, we need to work with a very, very decentralized statistical system. Finally, as we strive to modernize and we try to move away from just relying on household surveys and looking at other potential data sources, including administrative data, there is also this sense that we are talking about people and we are linking people and individual characteristics, and that there is very low public acceptability for administrative data linkages. So these are all the problems. Now, how are we going to address and come up with some solutions? Knowing that we have decided to put the spotlight in particular to this request for data, social and demographic data that are produced more regularly in a more timely manner. So we cannot wait 3 years before we disseminate our products, and data that are much more granular and disaggregated. So the FOC group has established 3 subgroups, let's call them 3 work streams, and we have agreed to work on the follow. There is a group working more at the global level, looking at what we collectively, so international level, meaning global and regional, what we collectively are doing in the space of social and demographic statistics. We are reaching out to the many task teams, city groups, expert groups working in this space and reporting to the UN Statistical Commission and to the statistical commissions of the regional, at the regional level, to really make an inventory of what's their mandate, what they're doing, and more importantly, what are the products that they are proposing? What are the data? What are the tools? What are the solutions that they are offering to countries? So that's workstream 1. It's led by Colombia. The second subgroup or workstream is working more at the national level. So we are taking stock of how these 10 countries are producing granular and high quality social and demographic statistics, and trying to see what are some common denominators that could be scaled up at the global level. And then the third work stream is really focusing on elevating the role of social and demographic statistics in the eyes of users and producers. So it's really engaging with our users, better understanding how we can customize our products, and also maybe making the case and showing the value of social demographic statistics. What would happen if we didn't have social and demographic statistics? So we are trying to really elevating this important statistical pillar and to the same level of economic statistics or even higher weight. So let me quickly zoom in just on workstream 2, because I believe this is the most relevant for our discussion today on beyond GDP, metrics of progress going beyond GDP. So within this group, we are looking at 3 elements. We have just, to be honest, we have just started working together, so I don't know how much I can share with you today, but at least I can share you the vision. We are looking at identifying the building blocks within the social realm. So we talk about work, we talk about education, we talk about health, we talk about some other common thematic areas. I call them building blocks. But what about governance? Is it part of the social statistics domain, or is more cross-cutting? So we are trying to address these type of issues. We are also looking, of course, all based on national practices. We are also looking at the presence of conceptual frameworks at the country level. We know that at the global level, if we go within each of these sectors, each of these themes of building blocks, we have very solid statistical conceptual frameworks. We have agreed concepts, definitions, we have statistical classifications, we have methods, we have recommendations and guidelines. So at the level of the sectors, most of these social issues have strong methodological guidelines that can assist countries. But we want to see what happens at the country level. And of course, moving to point C, we want to see how we can better integrate these different themes and building blocks. So we want to clean up and better organize the social statistics space. Maybe not everything can be linked, but as much as possible, we are trying to achieve that. And also we want to expand and try to link better across the pillars. And in particular, we are looking now at how to better link the social space, social statistics space with the economic space. So quickly on these last points, apologies, I can't move the, okay. So again, the idea is that to look at social, economic and environmental aspects together as much as possible, always being guided by the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. After all, that's the best framework for now that we have, and it's still valid. We still have 7 years to go. And also in our case, as we talk about people, we are also very much pushed, and we need to be completely aligned with this central promise of leaving no one behind. So for this, we are looking, as of now, we are reviewing at the country level under this workstream 2, quality of life indicators frameworks, because we think that's also an umbrella for conceptual integration, so theoretical at least integration that can bring together the key economic, environmental and social indicators and data sets. We are also looking at more in practice, not just conceptually, but more in practice, what countries are doing to build integrated social data ecosystems. And again, a lot of information in the social area comes from household surveys, but there is a lot also that can be taken from administrative records, and many countries out of the 10 that are working with us have a lot of experience on that. Look at administrative records, looking at non-traditional sources of information. Census, of course, is also at the basis of what we are proposing, and that's actually where I'm going, because we have decided that among the many themes or blocks that comprise the social statistics domain, we want to start also by zooming in into the population spine, into the population accounts, into what we call the statistical population register, and to better understand how this is established and maintained, starting with the 10 countries members of the FOC, and highlighting how what they are doing in the different national contexts. So some of our partners some of our member states are able to maintain this, I don't know, synthetic population data set without having a population register and without having a unique personal ID number. So we want to better understand, better document how this is all done so that we can maybe come up with some recommendations and ideas for other countries to copy. And to conclude on this slide, I want also to reflect for a second on the fact that once we bring the social dimension into this important discussion, we need to keep in mind that we are talking about people. So we are talking about people with their individual characteristics. So when we talk about statistics and statistical systems, that's our unit of observation. So we need to be able to zoom in and highlight their gender, their age, their socioeconomic characteristics, their ethno-cultural characteristics. So all of this is vital for us to be able to respond to policy and research questions. Of course, it's also about relationships among people. So we need to be able to locate, to situate the individuals within a social context. And that's where we are looking at measures of social connections, a measure of social cohesion. But it's also about outcomes, and that, of course, we want to have a sense of their living conditions and their quality of life, and that links well with our assessment and review of quality of life indicators. But it's also about information on places, on geography, on the location, because we know that where you are born or where you are living will have an impact on your ability to access services, on your opportunities to grow and to achieve your own potential. So that's another aspect that needs to be in the equation. And then, of course, we are also very much interested in the dimension of time. It's about your quality of life today. It's about your building on your quality of life and living conditions in the past as we project for the future. And we are asked to look at these life course approaches in all the statistics that we produce. Quickly to conclude, as we talk about integrating, so improving the social statistics domain, better integrating the different building blocks that are in this space, but also better integrating social and demographic statistics with economic statistics, with environmental statistics. I think it's so much better if we focus on a concrete example rather than talking in abstract terms. And again, now I don't know if I'm talking on behalf of FOC or more as UNSD, because this is just at the beginning of the discussion with the Friends of the Chair. But we think that focusing on care, on a comprehensive care system, and looking at care data and time use data would be a strategic way to connect the different domains, and also a way for us to move towards more inclusive measures of progress. So from a policy side, care is really an overarching concern. It touches on everything. It's about gender equality, because most of the caregivers, the care providers are women. Think around 70%, both in paid work and unpaid work. It's about labor market, it's about human rights, it's about policies on education, on health, on migration, and you name it. So we think that focusing on this as a case in point, care as a case in point, would be the way to go. Of course, we are statisticians, so we would also need to come up as a group and identify a statistical framework to measure care in these multidimensional aspects. Agreeing on standards, on definitions, again, understanding the themes and the building blocks, and understanding also who should be at the table, because this is really multidisciplinary. And then finally, after we discuss the conceptual framework, statistical conceptual framework, we should also making sure that we discuss and agree on the data infrastructure and the data governance. And of course, that would lead to having a set of care and time use measures that could also be used and proposed as complements to GDP. And they could be metrics based on time, expressed in terms of times, but also expressed in terms of money. And I think we heard in previous sprints, we discussed both the extended accounts on unpaid out of service work, as well as national time transfer accounts. That would be a nice way to attach a monetary value to some measures of time. So to conclude, what's going to happen next? We are preparing a report on the work done so far by the Friends of the Chair that will be discussed at the Statistical Commission in March 24. And it will be an executive short report highlighting where we stand for Workstream 1, as I said, led by Colombia. We will be able to share some preliminary results of this mapping exercise, who is doing what at the international level in this very broad space of social and demographic statistics, highlighting existing solutions and tools that we should build on. We are also reporting on Workstream 2 that is led by Canada. There will be an interim progress report on everything I just told you so far. And then we also have something about improving, making the case for social and demographic statistics with our users. That workstream is led by Poland. So yes, thank you very much again for this opportunity. The group, the FOC, has 2 years to come up with a set of recommendations. We are just at the beginning of our discussions, and I still look forward to report back at the next opportunity. Thank you very much, Ivo.
Fantastic. Thank you, Francesca. This is really great to provide that overview, and congratulations with the progress. I think that goes also with it, because it shows that there's a clear sort of path forward to be considered, and probably to engage also with others in this particular field. Thank you for providing that opportunity to see where we can build out. I really think that the Friends of the Chair should be as transparent and open as it can be, and open it up the vault so that others can see and react, and that we have that opportunity going forward. So maybe we can bring that to the Commission, how we can really make the Friends of the Chair more sort of community oriented. I am absolutely aware of the time constraint that we're in. I didn't hold anybody back, neither Richard nor Francesca, because I thought it was very important to bring this forward and build. But we want to go to the next segment. So I don't see any particular questions, Richard and Francesca, that was related to this. As I also understand, this is more for information than discussion, but the discussion will be in the next session. So if it's okay with you, rather than opening it up, we move immediately to the opportunity of having some speakers. Richard, I see my name is also there to chair, but I don't chair. I'm going to pass it on to you, because you're the one that moderates this session, and I'm one of the discussants. So, Richard, back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Ivo, and thank you also to Francesca. Great presentation there, and that's really exciting work moving forward. So for this session, we have brought together the chairs from the different sprints that we've had to get some of their reflections on the conversations that we've had since June. And so very briefly, I'm going to very quickly introduce you. You're all on screen, so just give a wave, because you're going to do plenty of talking in a second. So we have Ivo, who you all know. We have Rutger Hoekstra from Leiden University. We have Tim Miller from UNDESA. We have Sonia Rouzan from Statistics Canada, and we have Eleanor Rees also from the UK ONS. And so I'm going to throw out some questions. We've given ourselves sort of half an hour for this, but therefore you're not going to hear everybody on every single question. We've tried to allocate them out a little bit to get people's best thoughts, but we're going to start with sort of an easy warm-up one to get people's juices flowing. We've heard a lot of presentations since June. We've heard a lot of good things in the sprints. But is there one big thing that you've seen or heard that has shaped or reshaped the way you think about how we should be moving forward? And so I'm going to open by turning to Tim.
Okay, so my one big thing was on display today. You saw it today in today's sprint, and you've seen it in all of them, which is the really fantastic work that's being done by all these different communities of practice. So, you know, these communities have well-developed methodologies. They're producing evidence in a variety of settings. And this evidence is being used by, you know, policymakers, researchers, the general public, media. So that brings me to, you know, what we do about that. Well, I think we want to exploit the synergies across these different communities. And, you know, that leads me into thinking about, well, on the production side, just the sharing of information across the communities, how they're confronting these common data issues, how they confront common methodological issues. I think there's a lot to be gained there. And then on the consumer side, you know, the users of the data, I think there it'd be great to develop like a consumer's guide to all these different tools. You know, what's the best tool for given purposes? And also, again, stressing the complementarity of these tools. You know, if you're going to build something, you probably need a hammer, you're going to need the saw, you're going to need all those things together. So that's what I took away.
Excellent. Well, that might feed us quite nicely into Rutger.
Yeah, I've been in this domain for 15 years or so. So I think what really part of what this UN process has given me is a more hope. When I wrote my book in 2019, the first sentence was, "This book is written out of despair," because of the huge, just the huge array. I think Timothy rightly points out that there's a huge a group of people working on this from a scientific, from a policy, from a statistical and a business perspective. But I do think the structuring and the experimentation parts, I think, are really important. And from that perspective, I think I'd like to point out two things. I really like, Richard, the way that you've also led this and also kind of summarized the debate a little bit in this framework of inclusive and sustainable well-being, because I think it helps to structure what we need, and then also linking that to the four domains, I think, of a social and economic and an environmental aspect. I think that is really structuring the debate. And at the same time, I think we also need to be very cognizant of the experimental nature of a lot of that integration that we'll be doing. And to me, probably what is most exciting is that we're now introducing, I think, Francesca's, you know, the work with the Friends of the Chair. So I think in the national accounting sphere, we've had the SNA, we've had loads of great coordination, I think, of the UNSD also on the SIA. But I think it's really exciting, actually, that we're now going to be introducing the social and demographic aspects to this debate, and at the same time being cognizant of the fact that that is probably, you know, there's a lot of experimentation and discussion to be had there. But that, I think, is my main takeaway, and think of the main legacy of this this group will probably be your framework. And I think the addition of the social and demographic part. And I think we also owe Ivo a little bit of gratitude there, because I think he has also been, you know, pushing this agenda for a very long time. So that would be my main takeaways.
Excellent, thank you. So let's keep going and sort of, what do we think is the right next step for the network's activity? And so I'm gonna turn first to Sonia.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry. So I led the third sprint session, which introduced the environment, social, and governance, or commonly named ESG topic, to the Beyond GDP. And we were lucky to have one of the representative of the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standard Board, join us. And he presented at the session the two new standards that have been developed and released in June by this organization. During the session, we also highlighted that the main challenge for ESG is to have comparable data. So the next step in order to advance the agenda for ESG is to definitely enforce the use of these new standards that have been released only a couple of months ago. But this is beyond the control of this community. So what I see as next step for this community, I think the sprint session was a good introduction. It helped us go through a fact-finding exercise, but I think it's now time to move on to something a bit more collaborative. While I was looking for panelists for this session, I did contact a couple of others NSOs, and they were all working on a strategy to address ESG, but they were not ready to come and present. In order to align our effort, I strongly suggest we move on to either a working group or a community of practice in order to develop common methodology, common tools, common strategy, and align our effort and not duplicate the effort. So that would be my main recommendation for the next steps.
Yes, it's getting down to that next level of detail in some of these discrete areas of work, which I think I would agree we've had the sort of a big discursive and ground clearing exercise, but getting down to the next level of detail it might be key. But Eleanor, what do you think?
So I'm going to build upon that and agree that it's now the practicality sides of things. So I think we learned from Rutger's presentation that there are a wide diversity of metrics and a wide number of metrics, all aimed at measuring beyond GDP. And really from that presentation, it's allowed me to reflect on whether it is the diversity and the number that's really hindering us here, or whether it is the language and the lack of agreed definition and scope for beyond GDP. So I think really we need to be considering practical guidelines to measure a scope that is agreed, but gives the flexibility for countries to consider what matters to them, and be that what matters to their residents or their governments or a combination of both, and ensuring that that can be easily communicated.
Thank you. No, I think the diverse range of users that we have in this space is probably one of the things that sets it apart, because essentially every data user at some point touches on something which is really important in this space. But obviously we, out of 2022, we put together the prospectus and we talked about the measurement of inclusive, sustainable well-being and the need for a framework, as people are saying, to take this forward. But I suppose the key question is there anything out of what we've heard in the 2023 series of sprints that's changed the way that we were thinking in that prospectus? Is there anything core that we need to update? So as Eleanor was last on the first couple of questions, I'm going to go to Eleanor first on this one.
So I have a couple of points to make on this question. And firstly, I'm going to come in and say that I think we've really seen that there are many cultural differences and cultural and country-based factors underpinning the development of wellbeing frameworks. And specifically, we outlined this in the fourth sprint, which is the sprint that I led on. So be it things like the timing of their development, cultural or language factors, or sufficiency levels, for example. And I think any guidance that is created really needs to acknowledge and support these differences. The second thing I really wanted to highlight on is that through Amit's talk, which focused on the UNEC survey on current wellbeing measurement, which again was from my sprint, one of the things that we really learned was that the majority of wellbeing frameworks include metrics on subjective wellbeing, but I really don't think subjective wellbeing has been given an awful lot of attention through these series of sprints. Now, for more than the last decade, subjective wellbeing research has really established itself as a new science. So for those who might not know, commonly subjective wellbeing focuses on questions such as how satisfied are you with your life? whether you think the things you do in life are worthwhile, how happy were you yesterday, and how anxious were you yesterday. And they're generally designed to cover 3 types of well-being. So it's evaluative, eudaimonic well-being, which is also known as flourishing, or hedonic and experience well-being. Now, we have established guidance on how to measure subjective well-being thanks to the OECD, and this was developed over a decade ago. So we have a really strong evidence base, really strong base of data, research into its drivers and what it itself is a driver of, and this is quite cross-disciplinary. So I'm going to give some examples. So research has been carried out in Bristol University, has already linked subjective well-being to our genetic makeup, and taking a bit of a UK focus here as to why people might be interested in subjective well-being data. So research that was carried here looked specifically at the relationship between voting and subjective well-being, and they did specifically looking at the EU exit vote. And we actually found that places with lower average subjective well-being, although didn't have a different pattern of voting compared to higher areas of subjective well-being, they did have lower voter turnout. And we also found that areas with higher levels of subjective well-being inequalities overwhelmingly voted to leave, whereas those with low levels of well-being inequalities voted to remain. And when that individual study also included income inequality in their modelling, income inequality wasn't associated to leave at all. So it's actually really important here to have captured well-being and subjective well-being inequalities. Taking on the line of voting as well, research by the London School of Economics has also shown that average well-being predicts the likelihood that an incumbent government will be voted out at an election. So again, some really important things here that you think policymakers might want to consider, and also subjective opinions that have historically been called fuzzy. So it's all really quantifiable. One last thing I wanted to just focus on is that in the UK, again, we've got published supplementary guidance on wellbeing guidance to our Green Book on policy appraisal. So it provides an overview of how wellbeing evidence can inform the strategic stages of policy making, as well as step-by-step guidance for analysts on how wellbeing impacts can be addressed, and where evidence allowed can actually be monetized and used in cost-benefit analysis. And our guidance also includes wellbeing use in monitoring and evaluation. And it is an expanding field. So, for example, there's recently been a book published by Carol Graham in America, which is showing, amongst other things, research on resilience and improved future academic attainment of children with greater feelings of hope. So I think this is a really important area that we haven't really touched upon yet, and is something that really should be considered.
Persuasive case, powerful case. I think I would agree. Subjective well-being, probably as an economist coming to this, wasn't front and center in my mind, but it's sort of become increasingly clear that we need to give it more of a focus. Ivo, same question to you.
No, thank you. I just build on what the others have said. I think most of us seem to be agreeing towards, a practical guide, both conceptually and in terms of the practices. I think this has been set out, and I think that reflects our earlier sort of proposal by developing 2 particular output on the framework of inclusive and social well-being, as well as in terms of developing a conceptual framework or a system, as we call it, for social demographic field. Now, what is the takeaway? The second sprint series again showed the tremendous progress made statistically, and we heard Francesca talking about that. That basically all of these domains are well established and have strong conceptual frameworks, but it is not brought together. So it's very difficult to, in a decentralized environment, to see the cohesion among them. And I think there's still much to be done, as we have done in the SNA and in the SIA, bring that cohesion across that field. And I think that's a discussion that needs to be held. We heard from Sharon and we heard from Atif about the tremendous development of policy framework. A central banker talking about economic and financial well-being rather than as a policy driver for a central bank. So again, you see that language coming in much more to people-oriented sort of outcomes that we are looking for. This is a real development, I think, that we should take note of. I think also, and I think Eleanor, you did it rightly, putting out that science has moved considerably forward on well-being, and that we have now a very strong underpinning that we can build on, and that's what the SNA and what is the CIA based on. We have now also an underpinning for well-being, and I think that that's an important sort of element that we were missing, and now we have that through the work of Deneve and Layard, for instance, on that from the UK. So for me, the next step would be to indeed bring this community together, going to the Commission, say, we have established that this is a multidimensional issue that we have to put forward. Can we think about bringing these community together in a more sort of standing group that works in terms of an expert group to consider these various sort of elements? We have to work out how that actually work, how to bring that together, but we can discuss that internally. Of course, also with Stefan, how we can bring that to Commission, that this is something that we would like to go forward. And I think that expert group also should have people from the Friends of the Chair, of course, in there, along with the national accountants, the environmental accountants, and so forth. And I think academia has played a critical role. Rutger now at Leiden University plays a critical role in bringing that and harnessing the academic process product. So I think it should also include the academics as well as possible, also the private sector, the issue that Sonia brought out, because I think we talk a lot about people, but we start to understand with ESG, businesses are also increasingly on the forefront of these discussions around well-being and welfare of people. So I think these issues has to be brought to the fore. So my situation where I'm trying to find myself in that as a network, we can take the next step, building on the arches of the SNA, the CIA, and probably also the arch that does exist of the work of Stone on the SDDS, and saying that work has been done, but we haven't seen that body of knowledge coming together in terms of a system. So I stop here, but I think the next step would be not to continue the dialogue through sprints, but much more having this broader community that we have now rallied, and bringing a structure around that in terms of an expert group going forward. But this need to be, as Francesca says, also very timidly, these are personal ideas, also among, let's say, the group that leads this beyond GDP, but we have to find out how that actually would be considered at the Commission, so that it comes there well accepted and well researched in a proposal that they can easily accept. So I stop here, but I think that will be, the next steps, as well as thinking about what's up and to be done next year. And I'd like the timeline till 2026, which was produced by Francesca. So also there, can we build on that timeline together by 2026? If you push it out too far, I think we do a disservice. I stop.
Excellent. So you mentioned there, Sonia. So I'm going to turn to Sonia to have sort of an NSI's view of this question as well. Sonia.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I'm going to bring you in a completely different space. Not going to pretend here that I am in any way a well-being expert. So you heard me earlier talking about a community of practice and working group. I think this collaboration is definitely needed externally, but we need to improve collaboration also within NSOs. So within National Statistical Office, we tend to work on initiative or framework in isolation. So let's give an example of my organization. So the SDGs, ESG, and well-being or quality of life in my example here are all led by completely different groups. But during my discussion with other NSOs, it seems to be the case in most of them also. So there's a value added to this type of structure. I think it does foster the development of expertise and specialized resource, but it comes also with a challenge, meaning it's difficult to reconcile the objectives of each parties, avoid the duplication of effort, and leverage the effort that were invested in developing one framework to the other. So what I want to say here is that I've seen a definitive progress in the past couple of years. Okay, so we're working better together. We do collaborate internally, but only on specific projects usually, not in an integrated fashion. So it needs to become a reflex and not an afterthought. We need to, I think, integrate better from the get-go and not just at the end of the project. So there's still some space for improvement, and I'm not coming here with a solution, but I throw it all there to have a discussion afterwards.
And I think it's something many of us recognise. So Eleanor and I sit in different parts of the ONS. I don't think any one of us has found the way to bring the right people together in the perfect shape yet. But so I think I'm hearing still a lot of support for the concepts of a unifying framework around inclusive, sustainable well-being as the way forward. So I guess the final question in this block is how do we see that fitting with the Secretary General's agenda, and how do we make sure that as a proposal it has that strategic fit? So Eva, let's go back to you.
It's an excellent question. You know, before I retired, I was part of a discussion on Beyond GDP, and we actually wrote a paper for the Secretary General at the time. It was a collaborative effort within DESA, I must say. So there were different policy departments from DESA working together, including statistics. And that somehow was picked up by the Assistant Secretary General there for DESA, and she brought it to DSG, and DSG liked it. So, you know, that's how the history is. And there's where we started to build, I think, a broader coalition. And you cannot be better placed than if you have the Secretary General launching an initiative, because now you have the opportunity of bringing the resources together from a highly respected international organization that basically has a very strong voice that we can build on. And I think, you know, it is for Stefan, but also for the Commission and the Bureau of the Commission and the Commission members now to actually understand what that actually means and bring, you know, that discussion of the Commission towards the Secretary General. And Stefan already indicated that there is a summit being organized on the future. That will be an opportunity for us to indicate where we are with our thinking and where we can contribute on the statistical side of things, but also bringing in the theory and practice in terms of policy frameworks. And I think we can contribute to that. He wants a particular dashboard. He wants to have also, I think, the underlying sort of statistical frameworks that allow him to actually propose discussions on the dashboard. And I think if we do our work well, we should at least start to think of ourselves as a network to make that contribution. But we have to put our hands together to make that proposal. But I think we should be in a good space to do that. I'll stop here.
Rutger, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I definitely think we could have you know, influence and help along in that process. And I guess I'd like to refer a little bit more to the first part of the questions about the unifying framework. I think what I would hope for the unifying framework is that we also manage to get more interdisciplinarity and interculturality. I think Eleanor's points are very well taken, that I think as economic statisticians, we're quite good at mainstream economics, so welfare economics, you know, measuring externalities, capital stocks, wealth accounting. And sometimes we're a little unaware, I think, of really valuable research in the well-being space and even in the natural sciences space. So, you know, in the well-being, there's the subjective well-being, which is actually happiness economics. So it is economic statistics as far as I'm concerned. You know, we have the capability approach, a Nobel Prize winner, Sen. We have Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner. So I really think we should also be thinking beyond welfare economics without throwing away. I think welfare economics, wealth accounting, externality is really, really valuable, but we really need to think beyond the mainstream economic welfare economics. And I think also there's a danger there that science might actually start to overtake, I guess, economic statisticians. I know, for example, that the SIA, of course, is also sometimes looked in terms of depletion or wealth accounting, but there are already scientists that are linking it to the planetary boundary framework, which is very much more a natural sciences framework. And so actually that data is starting to become useful to, I guess, non-economic statisticians. Natural scientists are finding that data useful. And I don't fully think that the economic statistical community is yet fully aware of those links that are there. And so I think if we have, I guess, economic statisticians that are interested in going beyond welfare economics and adding to welfare economics, I guess, the full plethora of scientific research that there is, I think we could have a really valuable contribution to the unifying framework. And I think it would also make it easier, for example, to integrate the social and demographic statistics that Francesco was talking about, because I think there you will find that there is a lot of discussions and disagreements once you start talking only about monetization, I think. So I think if we manage to get more of an interdisciplinary and intercultural process going, then I think we could actually have a really important contribution to the Secretary General's agenda.
Thank you so much. And in many ways, it'd be rude to ask a question about how well we fit the Secretary General's agenda without giving Tim from the UN itself the opportunity to have the last word. So, Tim, your
okay,
thought.
I'll put in the last word, which is one word I'll put in is that, hey, we should put the link to our common agenda, that report, in the chat, so folks can take a look-see at it. I think the two things I would just stress are that, what is our common agenda about? Well, it's about renewing the social contract. And so this kind of goes to what Francesca was mentioning about this importance of not just looking at people, but looking at relationships, right? So, I mean, social contract is all about our connectedness to each other and to future generations, our obligations to each other and to future generations. So I think that's a really important point to grasp in all of our work here. And then the other thing I'll mention about, again, from our common agenda, is this stress on intergenerational thinking. So we're really looking for very practical ways to operationalize this stuff into governance. So we're looking at long-term planning, thinking about the future. So we need to look at how our kind of measures are going to fit into that very practical framework. I mean, the reason we're interested in all this stuff is because we got these two big transformations taking place. We've got climate change, and then the populations are changing, going from these youthful populations to older populations. So anyway, I just think it's very exciting work, and I think that Benson has already put in the chat the link to our common agenda. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. I mean, to gather together the reflections from the sprints, I think is hugely important, because we've gone through such a mountain of information and material. To be able to consolidate that and draw out the key themes, I think, is absolutely key. I'm not seeing any questions in the sidebar. And as we're just about back on time for the agenda as planned, therefore, I think what I'm going to propose is that we turn back to Stefan to give us his reflections across the sprint and the key messages that he's drawn from our work. But before I do, I just want to say a really big thank you to all the speakers who've taken part over the sprint series, everyone who's collaborated to bring the sprints together. Special mention again for Benson and Jacqueline on Stefan's staff, who've achieved absolute miracles to wrangle together upwards sometimes of 200 people into a room and keep us all under control. So huge thanks from me, and back to Stefan for the final word.
Yeah, thank you all. And I just realized it's a lot easier to say opening remarks than to do closing remarks. No, but let me first say, I think, wow, this is the only word that comes really to my mind. I mean, this was, I think, an amazing journey across these 7 sessions of the sprint. And today's summaries and this last discussion of what was the essence and what do we need to take forward and how it just highlighted this once more. I think it was, I would call it an amazing stock taking of where we are right now and what are some of the options of going forward. And I think that brings me to my first important point. I don't think there's only one way forward. I mean, I think there may be a central path that gets a lot more political and policy attention, but I would not recommend that we now limit then everything to that. Whatever is going to become the central path, there is always room for more. There's lots of areas where work needs to be done and needs to be pushed forward, and it can be done and needs to be done. And the only conclusion that we have from this is it should be done in consultation and in connection, not people going out in outer space, but being aware that there are other paths and other groups working. So two very concrete steps I want to suggest. I mean, if one is, of course, I will not be able to draw a summary substantively. I will try to highlight a few key points I heard for taking things forward, also specifically of where I'm sitting at the UN and the statistics division. But I mean, I would really ask, I mean, I need the help of all of the wonderful contributors and the bureau of the network, and perhaps all of you, I mean, to write up a good summary, and that will go as a report to the Statistical Commission, because there is obviously also some advice that we need from the executive board. So that is the next step to be taken within the next month or two, that we get all of these inputs well reflected and into a report to the Statistical Commission. And then the second thing I would like to say, the 100 to 200 or maybe even more people, because we don't know how many people are repeat offenders with the various sprint sessions, probably many. But let's say we've reached probably 300-400 people here. And I think each and every one of you has become an ambassador of the Beyond cause, let me call it this way. And I don't want to lose any of you. You will go and work with different communities, and I think we will maybe staying in touch with us and with each other. So I think that would be a splendid outcome of this work. So a couple of points from where I'm sitting. I feel like I'm sitting in the middle of two processes. So on the left-hand side, I have the technical processes that are going on. There is the SNA review, and I'm very grateful to Richard that at the very beginning he made the connection also to the current ongoing discussions. There's the Friends of the Chair that Francesca described. And of course, there's the ongoing SIA work. So these are sort of three production side pillars, and they need to be connected with each other, and they need to be connected with this work. And on the other side, I have like the policy demand side, the Summit of the Future that is demanding um, some outputs that may most likely take the form of a preliminary dashboard within the next year. So these are all processes: SIA, Friends of the Chair Social, SNA review, and the Summit of the Future, that are already ongoing. So we need to make an input into that and connect them all. I think that's and everything that comes out of this sprint that we can take into these processes to strengthen them and connect them further is an immediate task, an immediate to-do list. What are a couple of the key things that I heard? I mean, we talked a lot about the social and demographic. Francesca, Tim reminded us that it's also not only about the individual, social is also the societal and the group dimension, and so on and so forth. We have this idea in the background of having a system of population and social statistics, which would be the third pillar of with the SNA and the SIA underlying the framework of inclusive and sustainable well-being. And I think that's definitely the path we need to pursue. When and how fast and who is doing it, I'm looking at the Friends of the Chair in social statistics to advise us on that. But I think it's definitely on their agenda and it needs to be there. So that's one area. Then I like the area that Sonia also touched on. That's the second follow-up. I mean, with the corporate aspect, that we don't want to lose the ESG work. I think there is an opportunity of where this stands right now. You call it a community of practice. I think because there is a need, two things to make to standardize the efforts a little bit, the noble efforts that come from different parts, and also to uniform it a little bit and go perhaps a little bit from the voluntary to a more I don't like the word mandatory, but more systematic collection of information and so. But that will, of course, require a whole new dialogue with a whole group of people that we're also not very used to talking to: investors, employees, employers, and business community. And so, but I mean, that is definitely, I think, and one of the areas also where we should push it. I mean, to go forward. Then, I mean, the third one is the going beyond averages. We came again and again and again, and I think this is this whole work in the social and demographic areas, the need for it, in a way, it is very simply connecting the macro and the micro in the economic world happens to be people on one side of the equation. So I think that is very important. So I think we need to bring, and we all know that averages are not doing the job, and we need to work on that together. And I look in particular, really, I believe probably at the economic and social communities to work on these things together in a particular way. Then we touched on that. I almost once called it what religious warfare between composite indexes and dashboards, but I don't. I mean, as a naughty director, when somebody offers me a choice between A or B, I always say, "Can I have both?" And I think there is room for a reflection how these are connected to each other, because they're two obvious, simple structural ways of connecting them. We could have you could have a dashboard that contains composite indices, and on the other hand of the dashboard, you could have a dashboard and work with primarily with a dashboard, but you could build a composite index on top of it and distinguish for different uses and purposes. So I think there is room for a little bit more work, and we can see whether we can take that forward in one form or another. Another topic that I heard time and again, I think, is this need for synergies and talking together, different groups coming together. And there is really no place right now. We even said at one point we need to learn language from each other, where the different sectors they come together. And it's not only economic, environment, and social demographic, it is also the academic, private sector. And so where is the space where this meets? So perhaps there is in the whole architecture that is coming up space for an underlying reflection group or advisory group, whatever is going to be the political process at the end that formulates beyond GDP at the highest level. But I think there should be a support group, a very broad support group, and should be people like those that are in the room right now. And we need to find a way and make a proposal to the Statistical Commission of how we can make this a little bit more permanent. So I think these are some of the central thoughts. I'm also mindful of time. I think I also heard one thing that I liked a lot is in a way, there is a little bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, we are talking about develop frameworks and norms and concepts, and on the other hand, I always hear the words we need some practical guidelines and no and I think the answer to it is again both. We need both. We need probably a string that works in the medium and longer term towards a more, and there are slightly different people. We need to figure out who's best as which. But to develop, for instance, a big framework, I think we should not give up on that ambition. But on the other hand, we need something in between. and develop some practical steps where countries that are moving into that direction also really find some very practical help. And I believe it is possible to have this dual approach, and then one informs and supports the other. Also, it's a little bit in the SNA review. You also have now sort of a hybrid process of developing a big new norm, but at the same time we are doing preliminary implementation, which is sort of a testing ground whether some of those big conceptual ideas are actually afterwards applicable in a practical world, and so on and so forth. So combining the normative and the practical, I believe, is not impossible. But okay, those are a couple of key thoughts that I retained, but I'm not pretending that I've done justice to each and everything. So that's why I'm appealing to all of you and help to come to a good report and the write-up of this sprint sessions, plural. Because it was just too valuable and too precious to lose it, and we condense it then into a report to the Statistical Commission so that it's given also due consideration at the executive level. I think this is the moment we have to thank everybody, and we've done this multiple times. It is, of course, the network itself, the bureau of the network, my own staff, and I mean, these are all critically important to get this all done. We said at the beginning that we are still sort of in the proof of concept for the sprint. I think we can drop that because I think this sprint session has really shown that this is a fantastic format. It brings the community, of the willing, the coalition of the willing together. It attracts people from very different backgrounds, and that in itself is an unusual richness. And in that sense, I'm already looking forward to future sprint sessions. I know, stay tuned, the network, we may be getting to a preliminary end. There's no end of the GDP and beyond discussion, I can tell you that. But we get to the end of this format of a discussion on the GDP or beyond, but we will not. We have further sprints coming up. If you thought you get some rest, you were mistaken. So we will continue. There's the next sprint session under the network coming up very, very soon. So please stay tuned. And yeah, these are my final conclusions. Richard, are you have some concluding remarks from your side?
No, I will just very quickly follow on and say our next sprint series is going to be on the topic of classifications, which are changing, obviously revising in parallel with the system of national accounts, and there's a whole bunch of really interesting questions in there. So do please watch out for that. If you or your colleagues would like to register for future sprints, the nes@un.org website email is the place to contact. We very much hope you've enjoyed this series. We very much learned an awful lot. I know I've enjoyed them. It's definitely been a bit hectic at times, but I've been delighted that the team's been able to pull together so well. And I wish you all a very, very good rest of your day. Thank you all. Hopefully see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Greetings around the world.